All right, so I wanted to do my project on the Elizabethan poor laws and disability. So we'll go and talk about some of the stuff that led up to the Elizabethan poor laws. So like Christianity gets legalized, right? And they recognize, and early Christians recognize that one of the bigger parts of Christ's ministry was organized relief efforts for the poor, right? He really, really wanted to take care of the poor and the needy and provide service to other people. And so monastic and church communities largely organized relief efforts. And this just continued to expand through these centuries. So in the 6th century, early hospitals were established to take care of the destitute. A lot of these were also sponsored by religion. And then during the 11th century, the Archbishop of Lanfranc basically says that monastic houses are duty-bound to care for the poor, the disabled, and the needy in its immediate vicinities. And so if you lived in at that time in any like major in any city that had a decent population, you probably had monastic houses or monasteries, essentially. And so for a long, long time, religion was the key to get any sort of financial or relief or food or meeting your basic necessities, right? It was the only way that people really ended up getting that kind of assistance and help. And that's kind of where people turned to. And it was really the only one. There wasn't anything codified in government yet. It was kind of like rely on your family or rely on the church. Those are the options that you have. And so that's when we get into King Henry, who I really don't like. I don't like King Henry. King Henry didn't like the Catholic Church because he wanted to marry Anne Boleyn and divorce his first wife. Catholic Church doesn't believe in divorce. And they were kind of like the main and only, predominantly only religion. I don't want to say only because there were others, but they were pretty much the kind of the ones, right? But King Henry says, fine, you're not going to let me marry Anne Boleyn, then I'm going to essentially kick you guys out. I'm going to kick you guys out of organization in my government, and the Catholic Church is going to be kind of more displaced. And so he calls himself, the supreme leader, the supreme head of the Church of England, and then he dissolves 800 monasteries. He wanted both the Catholic Church's wealth and the consolidation of power for himself and his court specifically. He didn't want the Catholic Church to be a disagreeing power with him in government at all. So, boop. He was like, fine, we're getting rid of you guys. And so, with that sort of consolidation of power and that like driven to like corruption and power that this man had, um, it displaced thousands of people who relied on the Catholic Church. And we've already discussed about how Catholicism was kind of the main thing back then, right? And that was like where people turned to get food, to get financial aid, to get assistance, to get the basic necessities that they might need, housing, etc. Um, and then all of a sudden, that was just gone. So it's considered one of the most disruptive events in British history due to these things. And it was a really big problem. Like, it was a huge deal. So then we get to Queen Elizabeth, who I do have a soft spot for. I know that a lot of her laws weren't perfect, and they were really missed a lot of things in gaps, and they were severe in ways. But she essentially sees this problem that she's inheriting from her father. And she's the only surviving child of King Henry VIII at the time, and she's also the daughter of Anne Boleyn. And I think she was a toddler around when her mom got beheaded. And so she's coming into this situation. She was pretty divorced from court too, so she had to kind of struggle to find her place as well. But when she does find her place, she inherits some big problems. Poverty is skyrocketing due to the displacement of people with disabilities and those in poverty. Um, so with that big displacement, there was never a system that got put in place to solve it. They never replaced a system when they got rid of a system. They get rid of the 800 monasteries. They didn't, replace it with something else. So people were just completely displaced. Vagrancy is a huge problem at the time. Things are on the rise, right? Um, there's economic instability. Crops aren't doing well at the time. They're kind of failing. And during this time where crops are not producing as much or they're failing altogether, the population doubled. And then inflation becomes rampant. And so people aren't working. They're having a hard time finding work. There's a surge in population. And then additionally, more people were returning from war. Like there were some wars that were ending during her time in her rule. The Anglo-Scottish Wars were coming to an end. The Nine Years' War was coming to an end. And then because Henry VIII had like kind of got rid of the Catholic Church and caused a bunch of problems with them, they also have very strong roots in France. And so there were on and off military conflicts with France, although none of them turned into an all-out war at the time. So then when you're looking at this through a disability lens, you have people who are already displaced that have disabilities, and then you have people coming home from war. And war is going to create more and more people who also have disabilities. Legs get blown off. Um, People end up getting infections, sometimes, cognitive impairment due to war. Like war ends up creating disability, right? So you have these problems on the forefront of your mind when these things are coming in to play. And so she ends up setting up a series of laws. One of them was the Vagabonds Act of 1572. She shifts responsibility for the poor from religion, trying to replace the system, right, to local communities by implementing mandatory taxes. Justices of the peace ended up evaluating and registering individuals to determine how much support they needed. And then parishes collect taxes weekly from individuals. Those who refused to pay their taxes were imprisoned. So it was kind of a very, strict system where they're like, we're implementing this tax. You have to do this tax. It's going to support people in your community. It's going to support the needy. It is what it is. Um, yeah. And so that is probably going to kind of be indicative of some harsher sides that we see from Queen Elizabeth at the time as well. But those are kind of like some of the understanding back is she's like, we are going to make a system that isn't reliant on religion, but it relies on government to help these people out, right? And so, as you said, it wasn't perfect. It focused on severe vagrancy laws. So unlicensed beggars who weren't approved to do it were whipped or burned through the gristle of their right ear with a hot iron, right? To not beg, essentially. Like you weren't allowed to beg unless you got a reason to beg, essentially. Like you have a disability, you are elderly, those kinds of things. Repeat offenders who begged without the permission of the government could also face the death penalty if they kept doing what they were doing, unlicensed begging, essentially. And these restrictions were to prevent able-bodied people from begging. So it's just like they look at you and it's like, oh, if you don't have an obvious disability, or if you're not obviously old, or if there's an obvious impairment, you're gonna be working, right? And so it was very strict, and it was very, very harsh. Elizabeth did not want people who could work to not work, essentially. It was extremely, extremely harsh, right? And so then we move on to the 1576 Act, which required local towns to provide raw materials so the able-bodied who are unemployed could work and sell them. So they'd be like, here's wool, here's wood, here's some iron, make some stuff, try to sell it, right? And so it was framed in both a way where it was like, oh, this is extremely helpful, because it's just like these people are in poverty. They can't get the things that they need to make their clothes or to make clothes to sell. They can't get the things that they need to try to make an income, right? Or to be productive in society. So in a way, it was seen as like, this is going to help people, but it also punished people, by being like, like, you have no reason to not be working, essentially. And then it also established corrections where inmates were often forced into hard manual labor, like people who were continuing to beg without, a license. Um, and because the labor was so manual, it was so challenging, it sucked so bad, it was an incentive to avoid begging and prison time. So good and bad there. Once again, a lot of strictness and severity with these kinds of laws. And then we have the 1597 Act. And this is the last one that I will cover before we get into the poor laws. And so this appointed a local overseer in every parish to assess needs and collect funds. So it'd be like, hey, what's going on in this parish? What do they need help with? Let's get the money to get these guys going. Like if there's a significant disability population, or if there's a significant elderly population, that would kind of be what they would do. It authorized the collection of mandatory property tax and divided people who were in poverty into three distinct groups. I broke two. I'm in three. Sorry. So there's the impotent poor. This is people who are elderly. They're disabled. They need support to make it, right? And then there's able-bodied poor. These people are expected to work in some way, and maybe they're poor because of economic stuff or like situations that are going on, but they're not just idle poor. And these people were often punished for just not working. Like the able-bodied poor might need like wool, like we were talking about, or other stuff to support themselves or to get going. The idle poor were just people who refused to work, who had absolutely no reason, put that in quotes, to not work, right? And so then we start looking, oh crap, sorry. Come on, let's move backwards. So then we start looking at these acts, right? So these three acts kind of get consolidated into one law called the 1601 Act. And this is kind of what ends up making the Elizabethan Poor Laws. It does require family assistance first, and then parish support if the family assistance could not be provided. And family members who didn't want to provide support they could have been imprisoned. They could have like some sort of laws put against them for not cooperating, essentially. So she wanted family to be the first line of defense. And if that could not be provided, then parish support was good, right? It additionally forced businesses to provide apprenticeships to poor children, teaching them vocational trade. it kind of feels reminiscent a little bit for our system in our society where we're really interested in vocational, training and vocational trades and getting people into work, right? And so that one felt reminiscent of what we have in our today and age. But eventually these laws would force those receiving a relief to wear colored pee on their clothes, which would stigmatize them. So it wasn't necessarily like, oh yeah, we're just helping out these people, they're just needy. I think it started that way. But back then, like they were like Elizabeth was strict, like I said. So she wanted everyone to kind of feel bad, essentially, or be stigmatized by others, because they were receiving, situations from their parish, and the peas would come in different colors based on the parish and stuff. So yeah, there was a lot of interesting stuff going on, right? And so one of the things that comes to mind when I'm looking at all this information is some disabilities aren't visible, and these laws were clearly very based on visible disability, right? It's like if there was somebody with Down syndrome that was a visible, like it was very visible for them to have it, that person might be able to get on like some sort of assistance from the parish or their family, right? Required assistance. But like mental health ones, maybe even ones where people came back from war, you know what I mean? Because there were those wars going on, and it was like PTSD or some other sort of thing that was invisible. They probably wouldn't be getting relief. And so if there was constant violations of the law or constant vagrancy, right? They would be forced into very horrible physical labor. Some of them were subject to beatings at the time too. It wasn't a very good situation. And, or, being hung or being put to death because of refusing to work, being um, reluctant to work, essentially. And so that kind of sums up, my research into this. Um, and yeah, so I hope you enjoyed it. I really enjoyed digging into the history and kind of what led up to it. Displacement, I think, is a huge thing. Um, it's something that needs to be talked about sometimes, when we're removing laws. I think more broadly, it's to learn, like if we're removing laws that protect people, what system is place to be a safety net for those people that it was protecting? So yeah, overall, thank you for watching my presentation.